Okay, so welcome back to today's afternoon session. In this session, Professor Suman Majumdar will continue his discussions on 21 centimeter cosmology. And I'm pretty sure that is going to be a very exciting session, just like the previous one. So over to you, Suman.
Thank you, Supratit. So let us start. Second. So we discussed about the fact that how one can calculate, or basically what is brightness, differential brightness temperature with respect to CMBR in the context of 21 centimeter signal, and how it is basically related to spin temperature, which is a representation of the population density in two different spin energy levels of the hydrogen atom. Okay, now the next thing is that I would like to basically point out or discuss is that I raised a question at the beginning in the previous session, that why don't we look for Lyman alpha emission? Why we are looking for 21 centimeter signal? And the answer lies in the optical depth. So first of all, as we discussed earlier, it's very unlikely to have 121 centimeter transition in hydrogen atom compared to a Lyman alpha transition, even in any kind of thermodynamic equilibrium. Particularly when we consider thermodynamic equilibrium, it is very unlikely. So let us then go back to our calculation of tau again, because if you remember, we assumed that the absorption coefficient for 21 centimeter signal were taken to be of a specific form, and I essentially said that we will discuss it, why it takes this particular form. Okay, so let me share my screen and then we'll go get back there. Right. So here it is. Right. I hope everybody can see it right now. Yeah. So here, basically, we will start with some basic calculations of radiative transfer. So as we know that there are various kinds of Einstein coefficients that essentially tells us about spontaneous emission or stimulated emission, or in case of absorption, etc., which essentially quantifies for a particular physical process. Okay, so in this case, the physical process that we are referring to is this 21 centimeter transition. Okay, so now let us designate different or let us discuss different notations that we will be using eventually. So A10, and they are more or less following the usual convention that we have considered for any kind of physical interactions Einstein coefficients. So A10 is Einstein coefficient of spontaneous emission from level 1 to 0, or transition probability per unit time from level 1 to 0. B01 is the Einstein coefficient for spontaneous absorption from 0 to 1. B10 is the Einstein coefficient for stimulated emission from 1 to 0. And B01 times J bar. J bar is the average specific intensity in the background. Okay, in which this hydrogen atom is sitting. Let us assume that there is an average specific intensity of radiation in the background. So transition probability per unit time due to this absorption from 0 to 1 would be B01 times J bar, and transition probability per unit time due to spontaneous emission from level from level stimulated emission from level 1 to 0 would be B10 times J bar. So now the J bar, as I said, it is the average brightness temperature, or average specific intensity of the background. So if I am considering a particular line, in this case, this is a 21 centimeter line. So it will be an integral over 0 to infinity over all the frequency values, where specific intensity of J nu times phi nu. Phi nu is the line profile. So only the integration will have any kind of meaningful contribution within that line profile width. Okay, which is assumed to be very small, right? So now let us consider that these hydrogen atoms are in some sort of local thermodynamic equilibrium. So I can write that the total number of transition per unit time per unit volume out of state 0 should be equal to total number of transition per unit time per unit volume into the state 0, right? That will constitute the thermodynamic equilibrium. So I can write down in that case in N0 times B01 times J bar is equal to 01 is out of the state 0 to state 1 is equal to N1 times A10 plus N1 times B10 times J bar. So this would be my balance equation in some sense under thermodynamic equilibrium. So now I can estimate to achieve, so under thermodynamic equilibrium, this should be the balance equation. So to achieve thermodynamic equilibrium, what kind of background specific intensity I need, I can estimate from this particular relationship. So I can estimate what is the background brightness temperature or brightness specific intensity J bar should be through this relationship. So additionally, I know that in thermodynamic equilibrium, I can also write down the population level. I can equate the population density in two different states to their spin temperature, which we have already discussed earlier through this particular relationship. So I essentially replace this N0 by N1 with this particular expression where G0 and G1 are the degeneracy of the two states. So my final, my expression for J bar, which is required background specific intensity for thermodynamic equilibrium, becomes this. So in thermodynamic equilibrium, one can also assume that J nu is equal to B nu. B nu is essentially the black body Planck function. And the fact that B nu also varies very slowly over the on the length over the frequency scale delta nu. Delta nu is the, let's say, width of your line profile, the phi nu. Okay, so I can safely assume that B nu, as it does not vary much within the line profile width, is equal to J bar, which is required to, which is the required specific intensity to keep the atoms in thermodynamic equilibrium. So I can replace the J bar here with B nu, which is the Planck function for black body at temperature T. So now comparing this and the previous equation that we have here. So I can write B nu equal to this, and I have the Planck function, which is this. These two should equate. We can find out that A10 will be equal to B10 times 2h nu cube divided by c square, and G0 B01 will be equal to G1 B10. These two equalities should hold so that this expression and this expression are same. So this is the detailed balance equation, which depends only on the atomic properties and not on the temperature. Okay. So the absorption coefficient of 21 centimeter line alpha nu then can be written as h nu times basically can be written as h nu that we have already earlier written down, h nu by 4 pi times n0 times b01 into 1 minus g0 by g01 n1 by n0 times phi nu. And now I can essentially replace this particular relationship with this exponential e to the minus h nu by kt. And using the detailed balance equation, one can also write b01 would be 3 times a10 c squared by 2 pi h nu cube. So finally, alpha nu will take the form as this. Now, assuming that the H1 radiation from a physical line element with the same argument that we had argued earlier, that delta nu, the line width of the line profile, width of the line profile, can be written as delta L by A times 1 by dRT nu. And finally, one can essentially, as one can also approximate this integral over line profile, which we have also approximated earlier, as equal to a square del r del nu. And if I replace all those quantities in my expression of tau nu, it will take this form. So now let us look at it. Here I have some dependence on nu and some dependence on a square. A square will then translate into z square, 1 plus z whole square or whole cube, depending on how in which nu you are representing things. So if you represent everything in terms of observed frequency, then it will become 1 plus z whole cube. If you remember, that's what we found finally. So yeah, so now this n0. So n0 is the number density of hydrogen atom in the ground state, and we are assuming that n0 is 1/4 of NH1. NH1 is the total number density of neutral hydrogen atoms, and I'm assuming because of the degeneracy of state to start with that 1/4 of them are in the ground state, and the rest of the atoms are in the higher energy states to start with. So if we replace all those values here, tau nu will take this specific form, and we already have derived what is del R by del nu. So if which is lambda E divided by A square HA, if I replace that here, it will turn out to be 3 times NH1 HCQ A10 32 pi kTs nu emitted square Hz. So there is this NH quantity is there, so which is number density of neutral hydrogen atom, total number density of neutral hydrogen atom. So now I can write it in terms of, because it varies from point to point in the sky, so it will be a function of redshift as well as it will be a function of position. So I can write it in terms of average number density of hydrogen. So when I'm saying average number density of hydrogen, that means both neutral as well as ionized hydrogen. That's why I have written it in terms of NH bar as a function of Z. So that average number density will vary only with Z. And 1 plus delta, where delta is the density fluctuation of, or density contrast of, neutral hydrogen atom. Okay. Times XH1. So XH1 is the fraction of the hydrogen that is neutral. So NHZ is the total hydrogen, XH1 is the fraction of hydrogen that is neutral. So NH times XH1 will give me NH1 average. So NH bar times XH1 bar, let us say, will give me NH1 bar. However, this XH1 will also be a function of position, because in some places the hydrogen might be neutral, in some other places it might be ionized. So it will depend on the underlying matter density fluctuation as well as the state of the hydrogen atom, both of which are functions of position. So this delta, let us designate it here precisely, that both of, sorry, yeah, this delta here, this XH1 here, both of them are functions of X or position in the sky. Okay, and obviously they will also be dependent on the redshift as well. As the density, as the redshift changes or cosmic time changes, they will also change. So that is something one should keep in mind. Okay, if that's the case, and then I can write down this NH bar average in terms of rho H bar average, rho H bar divided by MH, which will give me the number density of hydrogen atom. MH is the mass of hydrogen atom, essentially. So then I can also write down rho H bar in terms of rho H at Z equal to 0 or at the present day times 1 plus Z whole cube. So that is how the density will scale. The higher the redshift, the higher the density will become, and it will scale with the volume inverse. That's why 1 plus Z whole cube will come. And then I know that 3/4 of the baryon is hydrogen. So that 3/4 factor will come, and I will replace this rho H bar in terms of rho baryon, sorry, omega baryon times rho critical. Okay, times 3/4. So that will give me NH bar as a function of Z. Okay. So now if I replace all of these numbers, because at the end of the day, we have to estimate the optical depth. As I said, that the answer why 21 centimeter signal will be observable from early universe to the present day, which was emitted in the early universe, it will come smoothly to the present day, lies in the expression of this optical depth. So if I replace all of those quantities here, I still have my spin temperature. I have the XH1, which is basically neutral fraction of hydrogen, and all the other factors. I have the 1 plus Z to the power 3 evolution as well. So if I simplify all these things and assume matter dominated universe for the simplicity, and actually it's a fair assumption as well, because it is we are considering very high rate shifts. So then my tau nu will take this particular form. So finally this particular form it will take, and let me annotate. Where is the annotation? Yes. So the particular form that I am trying to basically point out is this one. Sorry. So here, let us look at this factor. This is 10 to the power minus 3. Rest of the factors are cosmological parameters. Omega matter, H, omega baryon. There is this redshift dependence, 1 plus Z whole to the power 3 by 2 is there. And then the positional dependence will come from XH1, fluctuation of XH1. And then there is TS will also be position dependent. So there will be one position dependent term. But if I similarly had actually, sorry, it disappeared. Yeah. If I had similarly estimated the Gunn-Peterson optical depth, or the optical depth for Lyman alpha photon coming from a high redshift, rest of the factors, if you look at the cosmological parameters, omega matter, H, omega baryon, and 1 plus Z to the power 3 by 2, and XH1, all these factors remain same, because I essentially manipulated the expression and brought them to the same or similar kind of footing. But there is a interesting change here. It is 10 to the power 4. Here it is 10 to the power minus 3. And here we have a TS. Here there is no such TS. Fine. So what does this expression tells us? This tells us that, let's say I'm considering this 21 centimeter signal that is coming from a fully neutral IgM, or the signal that is coming, it is interacting with a fully neutral IgM. Even then, the optical, because these things, if these factors cancels out and becomes 1, and TS is also something of the order of 1, and I forget about the redshift dependence factor, it will be of the order of 10 to the power minus 3. So what is the physical significance of optical depth? If we think about it, optical depth essentially tells you the number of interaction the radiation is going to have with the it is a quantifier for the number of interactions that the radiation is going to have with the medium through which it is passing. So if it has too many interactions, what will happen? The radiation will get attenuated significantly, and nothing will come out of the other end of the medium, right? So the radiation will be lost. However, as we can see here, there is a factor of 10 to the power minus 3 at the top, right? So that tells us, even if I consider all of these factors to be 1 combinedly, my optical depth will be of the order of 10 to the power minus 3. So even if the radiation is coming and interacting with a fully neutral IgM, it will see that IgM or that intergalactic medium almost like a transparent medium. The number of collisions or interactions that the radiation will have along its way within that medium will be very minimal. So the radiation will pass through with minimal amount of absorption, emission added to it. So I will see it as it is. However, if you look at this tau GP, GP represents Gunn-Peterson optical depth, it is already 10 to the power 4. So I have to have a neutral fraction of my intervening medium of the order of at least 10 to the power minus 4 to make my tau 1, if I forget about all the other factors, right? So I have to have a almost ionized intergalactic medium. So neutral fraction 1 means all atoms are neutral, all hydrogen atoms are neutral. Neutral fraction 10 to the power minus 4 means that means 0.001, yeah, 0.001% of the atoms or 0.01% of the atoms are neutral. So almost the entire IgM is ionized. Only then the Lyman alpha photon will pass through the medium. So the Lyman alpha photon can pass through a medium which is almost fully ionized. However, 21 centimeter photon can pass through a medium which is fully neutral. Right. So that is the advantage that 21 centimeter signal has, simply because of the fact, if I go back to one of the slides, that artist's impression slide that we had seen earlier. Let me stop. Yeah, this one. Share this one. Okay. Stop sharing and then share this particular screen. Right. So if you can see this particular image, basically, let us say there is some 21 centimeter radiation coming from this portion of the universe. So that radiation has to go through a significant amount of neutral hydrogen before it can reach us at the present day. We are on the right hand side of this panel and the signal is coming from the left hand side. So if it is a Lyman alpha radiation, it will not even survive even a little bit. It will get absorbed by its local neighborhood, the hydrogen in its local neighborhood. So that is why, because the tau or the optical depth for 21 centimeter signal is so low, that's why it can pass through a large neutral medium on its way to reach us. That's why it has the most potential to probe the higher redshifts. So you must have, Tirthoda must have discussed about a type of observation, which is the quasar absorption, high redshift quasar absorption spectra. So more popularly, these things are known as Lyman alpha forests. So what happens there, that there is a quasar or a very bright photon source, let's say, seated somewhere here at the edge of this reionization epoch, when reionization epoch is almost ending. So as it emits a copious amount of radiation and there is a peak in the radiation in Lyman alpha, the entire spectra blueward of the Lyman alpha can get redshifted. So by blueward of the Lyman alpha, I mean with wavelengths shorter than Lyman alpha. Redward would be wavelength larger than Lyman alpha. Okay, so the blueward, all the radiation that is blueward of the Lyman alpha will get redshifted at a certain cosmological redshift and reach the wavelength of Lyman alpha, right? And if there is an absorber in that particular location when this radiation is moving, or let us say the entire spectrum is moving towards you from this point towards right hand side, what will happen, that certain part of the spectrum which reaches the rest frame Lyman alpha wavelength at a specific redshift, if there is an absorber of the Lyman alpha, it will absorb it, because absorption coefficient or the scattering cross section for Lyman alpha photon with neutral hydrogen is very high. So if there is neutral hydrogen, even if it is a very little bit percentage, in percentage terms, it is less than 1%, less than 0.01%, it will still be able to absorb the entire Lyman alpha that is in its rest frame. That is why Lyman alpha, you will see basically black regions or dark regions in the spectrum of these high redshift quasars. And from those dark regions, you can actually point out that at what redshift these absorbing systems, neutral hydrogen absorbing system, which are consisting of neutral hydrogen, are sitting. But precisely because Lyman alpha gets absorbed so easily, you will not be able to use this as a tool to probe higher redshift, higher than, let's say, this edge of the reionization redshift. Because if the quasar is seated slightly deeper in the early stages of the reionization, then the entire radiation will get absorbed. There will be nothing left. So it will be difficult for you to ascertain because it can get absorbed just by a neutral fraction of 10 to the minus 4. So it will be difficult for you to ascertain what is the actual neutral fraction of that particular redshift or around the neighborhood of that quasar, simply because of the fact that any neutral fraction 10 to the minus 4 to 1 can absorb whole of Lyman alpha radiation. So that's why Lyman alpha, compared to Lyman alpha, 21 centimeter signal is a much more robust signal because of its strength lies in its basically small optical depth. Okay, so that is the answer to the question that means anybody can ask you if you have attended a course or any lectures on 21 centimeter signal, you should be able to answer this particular question or at least convince yourself why we should look for 21 centimeter signal instead of Lyman alpha signal. Okay, that was one thing. So we stopped the discussion in the previous session with this situation where we discussed under what condition I will see the signal in absorption, in emission, as well as there won't be any signal at all. So using this, actually, one can find out at what cosmic time, and obviously you have to assume certain, let's say, certain features in your modeling of this particular signal, or certain properties, certain physical processes that are going on in the intergalactic medium, certain kinds of sources that are being formed at a certain cosmic time, then you will be able to basically build a model for your global 21 centimeter signal based on these basic understandings. So let us discuss that next. I hope you can see my screen. So let me get into here. So what I am trying to say here is that the brightness temperature, so sometimes this sometimes people do write, instead of differential brightness temperature, they basically drop the delta and write just TB. So, but it more or less represents the same thing. So this TB now, as we have seen, depends on, or delta TB, let us say, it depends on various factors. One is this kinetic temperature, that is the overall kinetic temperature of your gas. Ionization fraction, what fraction of your intergalactic medium through which it is passing is ionized or neutral. The Lyman alpha background or the average intensity of Lyman alpha photon, that also is a factor that we will discuss why, and the number density of hydrogen atom, that is another factor. So all of these factors will essentially determine the brightness or the intensity of your brightness temperature or the magnitude of your brightness temperature. And the surprising fact is that each of these parameters or factors will saturate due to their corresponding, let's say, dominating physical process that with which they are associated with. Once those processes saturate, each of these terms will saturate, and then other terms will take over in shaping the intensity of your, or the magnitude of your brightness temperature. Okay, this essentially actually helps you to distinguish different epochs during our cosmic dawn to the present day. Okay, that what process, you can speculate what process will dominate when, based on some sort of physical model. And based on your physical model and based on that physical model, you will find out what process will dominate when. And based on that, you can actually predict the global 21 centimeter signal and various features in it. As well as you can also predict the fluctuations, spatial fluctuations in the 21 centimeter signal, given that you get the density fluctuations from some other source through some simulation or some analytical modeling as well. Okay, so we will next go in there. First, we will discuss the global variation in the global. Okay, let me remove those things that I have drawn here on drawing. Right. So first, we will discuss the evolution of the global 21 centimeter signal. Okay, so on top, essentially, this is a schematic diagram of effectively at different cosmic time, one particular process is dominating over the others. That is being represented here. And which process is dominating when, that is being represented here. And at the bottom, at similar kind of equivalent redshift, how the global 21 centimeter signal will look like, because this particular process is dominating at these redshift range that is being predicted. Okay, so let us start from the beginning. So let us start at redshifts, which are not even represented in this particular figure. So redshifts higher than 200. Okay, so let's say from CMB to redshift 200, what will happen? What do you expect to happen? During this period, there are no sources of light, right? There is only CMBR photons that are passing through, and you have your hydrogen atoms spread around, and you have some free electrons and free protons, etc., etc. So the CMBR photons will essentially basically scatter, do Compton scattering with the these free electrons, and that will effectively, what it will do, it will set the gas kinetic temperature to the CMBR temperature. So that gas kinetic temperature will be closely tied with the CMBR temperature. CMBR temperature also evolves with redshift. I guess you remember the redshift dependence of its evolution. And as at this early times, there is an overall average gas density is higher, because as the universe expands, the average gas density goes down. Though there are fluctuations where there will be higher density region where the gas density would be quite high. However, but average gas density is actually physical. Average gas density is going down. Co-moving density doesn't, but the average density does with the redshift. So earlier redshift, you have higher average gas density. So due to this higher average gas density, this will lead to an effective coupling due to these collisions between hydrogen atom and free electrons and hydrogen atom and protons, etc. So this kinetic temperature of the gas will be tied to the CMB temperature earlier due to Compton scattering. And now, because the kinetic temperature is tied with the CMB temperature, and the continuous collision is happening because the density is pretty high in the gas, so the spin temperature will be tied to the kinetic temperature and in turn to the CMBR temperature. So as spin temperature is equal to the CMBR temperature, and if you remember, when that happens, that factor 1 minus T gamma by Ts, that will become 0. So the differential brightness temperature will be 0. So on average, the differential brightness temperature in most of the places will be 0, and there won't be any detectable 21 centimeter signal. That is one of the scenarios until redshift 200 or so. Now, by redshift 200, what happens? After redshift 200, what happens? Redshift, let's say 200 to redshift 40. Still, there is no sources of light. Still no new sources has been produced, etc. But remember that the gas is cooling down adiabatically. So Tk will fall off as proportional to 1 plus z square. So that is a very fast decline compared to the usual redshift evolution of CMB at temperature. And that's why they will get decoupled. So the gas temperature will go down from the, basically get decoupled from the CMB at temperature, and it will fall off much more rapidly than the CMB at temperature because it falls off as 1 plus z square, z whole square. So this will lead to the scenario where the spin temperature, because spin temperature is still tied with the gas temperature or the kinetic temperature, so Tk, by collisional coupling. So still there are collisions going on, but the gas temperature is falling off very rapidly because of adiabatic expansion of the universe or adiabatic cooling compared to the CMB temperature. So this will lead to the scenario where Ts will be much smaller than T gamma. So when that happens, if you remember, Ts is smaller than T gamma, so T gamma by 1 minus T gamma by Ts, that particular factor will become negative. So you will see the signal in absorption. So at this time, the brightness so if you are looking at the global signal, it will look like a negative signal. So this is precisely the period we are talking about. So collisionally coupled regime that is written here, right? So this is the period we are talking about, this collisionally coupled regime, and that will represent the global signal in this region. So it will basically show your signal in absorption. However, if you think about what would be the spatial fluctuations of the signal, because these two figures do not represent the spatial fluctuation. Now, wherever the density of hydrogen gas will be high, that will essentially represent that there is an underlying dark matter density which is higher there. So essentially, if there is any fluctuation in the brightness temperature from point to point, it will closely be dependent on the dark matter density fluctuation, nothing else. So the fluctuations in the delta TB, or differential brightness temperature, as a function of x, if I write down here, this is represent as a function of z. If it is written as a function of x as a specific redshift z, that will be following 1 plus delta, where delta is the density fluctuation due to dark matter. Okay, so this is the typical dark ages 21 centimeter signal, where the signal will be seen in absorption. Okay, so that is the case. Sorry. Got it. Okay, fine. Yeah. Now what happens, now I will have some sort of galaxy formation or first star formation, let us say. So Z star is this elusive redshift when the first stars were formed, let us say. So redshift 40 to redshift of Z star. During this small period, or during this portion of your global signal, so the expansion is continuing, so that makes the gas density lower and lower. So even eventually this collisional coupling becomes more and more ineffective. So ineffective collisional coupling means earlier collisional coupling was tying the Ts, or spin temperature, with the kinetic temperature of the gas, or Tk. Now the coupling between these two temperatures will become weaker and weaker. So due to which, basically due to the radiative coupling, now CMBr will determine the spin temperature, because CMBr will interact with these hydrogen atoms, and Ts will basically come in equilibrium with the CMBr temperature. and eventually when it comes, it becomes exactly equal to the CMB temperature, there will be again no signal at all. So there will be a brief period from redshift 40 to redshift Z star, which we do not know around what redshift the first stars were formed. There is dispute whether it is redshift 15 or 30 or whatever. Let us say it is 30. So somewhere here. Around that time, the TS and T gamma will become almost equal. So almost a non-detectable signal will be there. So the signal will become almost zero. Now, the next phase of the evolution, when the stars are formed. Now, in the next phase, that is between Z star and Z alpha. Okay. The first stars are formed around redshift Z star. Let us say it is redshift 30 or so. So once the first sources of light were switched on around redshift Z star, they emit both Lyman alpha photon and X-ray photon. So initially, Lyman alpha photons, even if its emissivity is quite low, but it will be very influential because its optical depth is very high. That's why it will affect the intergalactic medium way more compared to the X-ray photon. So the X-ray photon, on the other hand, has a longer mean free path. So X-ray photon, rather than contributing in photoionization, they contribute more in heating the intergalactic medium. However, their effectiveness in heating the intergalactic medium is dependent on how much X-ray photons are being emitted by these sources. Initially, it will not be that many. On the other hand, even a little bit of Lyman alpha emission, a small amount of Lyman alpha emission will be very effective in interacting with the intergalactic medium thanks to its low optical depth. Sorry, high optical depth. So one would imagine that this Lyman alpha photons will start coupling the spin temperature now with the gas temperature. So the spin temperature was decoupled from the gas temperature or TK earlier, and it got coupled with the CMB temperature. That's why there was no signal at all, because TS is equal to TCMB. That is what has happened earlier. So that particular factor 1 minus T gamma by TS, that has become 0. But now with this new sources of light, they started emitting Lyman alpha photon as well. So these Lyman alpha photon will now try to tie the spin temperature to the kinetic temperature of the gas. And still they will be far below than because kinetic temperature falls off much more rapidly because of the adiabatic cooling compared to the CMB temperature. So there will be a rapid decline in the spin temperature compared to CMB temperature. So there will be an absorption signal because TS is now approximately equal to TK, and they jointly means TK is much smaller than T gamma. So you will see the signal in absorption. And the fluctuations, the spatial fluctuations in the signal will be dominated by two things now. No, it will be dominated by the density fluctuation, how much hydrogen is where. Also, it will be dominated by the variation in the Lyman alpha flux. Why? Simply because of the fact that these first sources of light, they are not large in number. As you can see around Z star in this graphical representation, there is only one star, let's say, compared to this ZT here. There is only one star. So it's a basically relative graphical representation, nothing else. Don't take it too seriously. But the point to note here is that the number density of the first stars will be very, very low compared to the number of stars that we see today. That's why the Lyman alpha coupling will be dominated around the IGM, around these first stars. So the fluctuation in the spin temperature will come from two source or brightness temperature of 21 centimeter signal will have two sources. One is obviously wherever the hydrogen density is higher, you will get a higher signal, etc. But on top of that, not every place where hydrogen density is high, you will have a first star there. Rather, the first stars are rare objects. So in certain special locations, you have these first stars. So on those locations, they will help more rapid, means the Lyman alpha coupling would be way more efficient, way more saturated in those regions. So that will introduce another level of fluctuation. So the fluctuations, the brightness temperature fluctuations will have two sources. One is the density fluctuation of matter. The other one is the Lyman alpha flux fluctuation from place to place. So until there are significant amount of stars formed throughout the, or let's say galaxies formed throughout the IGM, which can emit significant amount of Lyman alpha photons to couple the entire IGM, to Lyman alpha couple the entire IGM or saturate the Lyman alpha coupling, these fluctuations will be driven by Lyman alpha fluctuations plus the density fluctuations jointly. Okay, so this is what I was trying to say. So here the first galaxies were formed, and then the spin temperature is coupled to kinetic temperature thanks to Lyman alpha coupling. Now kinetic temperature is falling way more rapidly compared to CMB temperature or T gamma with redshift. So I will see a steep decline in my brightness temperature, average brightness temperature. And this, first of all, the brightness temperature will be in absorption because T gamma by Ts factor is there with a negative sign in front of it, and Ts is much smaller than T gamma. So it will be in absorption. And the basically depth of absorption will be higher here thanks to Lyman alpha coupling compared to that we have seen in dark ages. So overall, I would expect the amplitude of brightness temperature fluctuation or differential brightness temperature to be highest in this particular region. Okay, until the X-ray emissions and the heating of the intergalactic medium becomes important, because now it is what is happening. Intergalactic medium is because of rapid expansion of the universe, the kinetic temperature or the gas temperature of the IGM is falling off quickly, and there is no efficient heating mechanism yet to heat it up and counterbalance this cooling of the intergalactic medium. And Lyman alpha coupling is making sure that spin temperature is following the gas temperature. That's why we would expect the highest amplitude or highest magnitude. Let's say if I take a mod of the if I do not consider the sign of the signal in this region. And this is why actually AGES, SARAS, etc., all of these monopole experiments which are supposed to observe the signal as a function of redshift alone, they are not measuring the spatial fluctuations of the signal. They target this redshift range where one would expect from various kinds of models the highest dip in the signal. And that is precisely what the AGES signal has most likely or claimed to have detected, that around this redshift range, let's say 20 to 16, they expect that the signal to be to have the highest dip. However, there is a controversy about this particular detection simply because of the fact the amplitude. So here you can see it is in Kelvin unit and this is in millikelvin unit. And obviously this is one of the models. See, now you understand that how many first sources of lights are being produced, at what time they are being produced, what is their spectrum. All of these things are important in modeling your global 21 centimeter signal, right? Because all of those things will actually determine at what time the Lyman alpha coupling starts to become important and becomes a dominant process, and how well it will couple the gas temperature to the spin temperature. And so how quickly one would reach the saturation of Lyman alpha coupling, etc. All of those things depend on those model parameters. How many stars are being formed? What are the minimum halo mass to form these first stars? What is the characteristics of these first stars? By characteristics, I mean what is the spectrum of this particular first stars, etc. will determine these things. So the general, let's say, vanilla model, or the most, let's say, favorable models, that again, these are not based on observations. All of these modeling so far is being done with some physical argument, but not necessarily, there is no observational evidence to actually um, place one model higher up compared to others. So one would expect the amplitude to be somewhere around, let's say, 100 to 150 millikelvin, the maximum amplitude of this dip. However, here you see that the maximum amplitude of the dip is somewhere around 600 millikelvin, which is almost 3 times or more than the fiducial model that you may imagine. And that is why people were pretty much confused, and they were finding it difficult to have any physically motivated model to produce such a deep signal. And that has led to various controversies, whether this detection is a proper detection, whether there were systematics that are showing up as this dip, etc., etc. And one can argue on that. People have proposed various kinds of actual physical scenarios which will lead to, but those are extraordinary scenarios, to be honest, which will lead to such a higher amplitude in the global signal. But one way to basically get rid of all this controversy is to have another independent detection of the signal with around the same, let's say, redshift or frequency range. If that is possible, then if another independent experiment like, let's say, SARAS detects the same signal of same order of magnitude, let's say amplitude, around the same redshift, then people may have to think, okay, fine, as these two experiments have done the same thing independently, most likely it is a signal. Otherwise, it might be a systematics. Okay, so now let us say the heating has become effective. So now the X-ray photons by this time has traveled enough that they reached the boundary of their mean free path, and they started heating up the intergalactic medium in this process. So when the X-ray photon will start to heat up the intergalactic medium, so now the TK will not fall off anymore. It will turn around and it will go up. It will start to go up because the X-ray photons are heating up the gas, the baryonic gas, significantly. So once heating becomes significant and the gas temperature fluctuation, so then this TK, the fluctuations in TK will determine, because the spin temperature is now coupled to the CMB temperature, sorry, to the gas temperature. So the gas temperature will determine the nature of this brightness temperature. So gas temperature will pull up spin temperature along with it as it goes up. And eventually, as gas temperature goes up, spin temperature goes up, and so is the brightness temperature goes up from very high negative values to low negative values. And eventually, it will reach the scenario where the kinetic temperature, the entire IGM is more or less uniformly heated. So average kinetic temperature is comparable to the CMB temperature. So there you will have again a zero signal scenario, just like here or earlier here. And then the signal will start to show up in emission, because now you will basically heat up the intergalactic medium even more. So ZT to ZH, after this heating transition, the TK will be much larger than T gamma. So is the TS, it will be much larger than T gamma, because TS is tied with TK, and we will start seeing the 21 centimeter signal in emission. So the important point is that most of the cosmic dawn is the time when the first sources of lights were formed, and the dark ages, there I would expect the signal to be always in absorption. Only when the heating becomes a dominant process and it basically overshadows the CMB temperature, the kinetic temperature overshadows the CMB temperature, only then the brightness temperature of 21 centimeter signal will, or brightness, 21 centimeter signal will be seen in emission. So that's an important point to remember. Now, by the time it starts to show up as an emission signal, the heating more or less all over the intergalactic medium has saturated. So at this point, only the density fluctuation in the neutral hydrogen will be dominating the fluctuations, the spatial fluctuations of the 21 centimeter signal. Okay. Now something interesting will happen, and this is the beginning of epoch of reionization. Now, the ultraviolet photons will play a dominant part, and it also again depends on the types of sources, the new generation sources that are being formed at these redshifts. So they will start emitting a copious amount of ultraviolet photons. Ultraviolet photons are most effective in conducting photoionization of hydrogen. So now around these sources, so let us say these stars, you will see these red circular things. So these red circular things are nothing but, around these stars, you will see these black circular things. So these black circular things are nothing but ionized hydrogen regions. So the ionization start to become important, and now the neutral hydrogen density fluctuation will be dominated by this ionized region. Earlier, it was dominated by the underlying dark matter distribution. Whatever fluctuation in the dark matter distribution was there, that is being represented with some sort of bias via the neutral hydrogen. Now, because just imagine there is everything neutral, and I am suddenly starting to punch holes in this neutral medium. The holes represent ionized regions from where I will get zero signal, because there is no hydrogen. I should not get any signal at all. So the rest of the hydrogen will give me a signal in emission, and these holes will be zero. So overall, the fluctuations in the 21 centimeter signal now will be determined by the distribution of these holes and the sizes of these holes. Okay, so that is what starts to happen when the reionization starts. And that is the, let's say, beginning of reionization. And these ionized regions gradually grow in size and eventually overlap with each other. And finally, by the end of reionization, which is represented by this redshift ZR or redshift 6, more or less, most of the fiducial reionization model ends the reionization by redshift 6. Almost all the hydrogen in the universe is ionized. And there is again kind of a zero signal. And the signal will now come from only those locations, these damped Lyman alpha absorbers, where hydrogen density is so high that they can self-shield themselves from a severe ionizing background. Because now the UV photons are not blocked by any neutral hydrogen, they can freely move around, and they create an ionizing background. So always remember that when the ionization is happening, recombination is also happening. So you need to counter that recombination by continuously producing these ultraviolet photons. So to keep the universe ionized, so you have to produce enough photons to keep the universe, ultraviolet photons to keep the universe ionized, and with which you can actually do a back of the envelope calculation and estimate how many photons you need per hydrogen atom to keep the universe ionized at the present day. And it requires nothing but the expression of critical density and omega matter, omega baryon, etc. And you can take it up as a home task. I will not do it for you. So I think Tirthoda might have discussed it already. Yes, he generally discusses it in his lectures. So the only hydrogen that is left now are in these DLAs. So now you will have a cumulative H1 or 21 centimeter emission from these DLAs. Now, this emission from these DLAs, as you can imagine, is very, very 21 centimeter emission from these DLAs will be very, very feeble. So one would not be able to observe individual these DLAs through any realistic observational scenario. So what people do instead, they do something called intensity mapping. So they do a coarse gridded imaging. Okay, it's conceptual imaging, though it is being done in the Fourier space. But to understand it, I think the concept of imaging is easier. So instead of identifying each individual damped Lyman alpha system, what they target is to basically observe the cumulative emission from multiple such damped Lyman alpha systems. So they divide their field of view with very few pixels within very few grids, and they are interested only the cumulative emission that is coming from each grid. And from that, they can estimate what is the content of neutral hydrogen that is left in these DLAs overall on average. Okay, so and also one can essentially probe the very high density peaks in the intergalactic medium through this kind of intensity mapping, because only those locations will have neutral hydrogen, right? So that is what the 21 centimeter cosmology in the post reionization epoch. So more or less, I think I have covered the major portions of this global signal that I wanted to discuss. Now let us discuss something else, because yeah. Okay, so let us discuss this first. So somebody asked in the previous session that what are the how do you actually conduct these observations? So as I said, I'm not an expert on that, but I can give you a brief account of how things are planned effectively. But before we plan an observation, we need to know what are the obstacles there, because just to let you know, no signal from cosmic dawn or epoch of reionization or dark ages has been detected so far by any radio interferometric observation. So the global signal of experiments like AGES, just the AGES has published so-called quote-unquote detection so far, but none of the radio interferometric experiments where essentially you can also probe the fluctuations in the spatial coordinates, they have not reported any detection yet. They have reported only very weak upper limits through different kinds of statistics of the signal. And we will get in there eventually. But why this has not been possible? So what are the major obstacles in detection of that signal? So some of the major obstacles means there are three main obstacles, I would say. Some of them are solvable and some of them are very difficult to solve, and people are still working on them. Actually, there is no definitive answer yet in some of these problems. The first one is system noise. So as you can imagine, if you have a receiver, that the receiver will be associated with certain kind of electronics, etc. So it will have some sort of ambient temperature, ambient, let's say, noise always. So that is so-called that is called system noise. Now, if this system noise is higher in amplitude or magnitude compared to the target signal that you are trying to observe, then it is very difficult to beat down the system noise, right? So one way of beating down the system noise is by using one of the basic fundamental property of system noise. However, though I am saying this as a basic fundamental property, it may not be so simple, because there are lots of other complications. So people assume that the system noise is supposed to behave as a Gaussian random field. Now, you know, if it is a Gaussian random field, and then if you integrate it over a long period of time, let's say it's a Gaussian signal, and if you Gaussian random number generator, which you are integrating for a long period of time, what will happen? You will gradually, as you integrate more and more and more, you will beat down the variance of this Gaussian random field, right? The uncertainty of this Gaussian random field will go down significantly. So that is what is being done to get rid of the system noise. So the system noise in general is of the order of few Kelvin if you are observing the sky for few seconds. But the signal here, if I go back to my slides, if you remember, the signal here is of the order of millikelvin, 100 or 50 millikelvin, or let's say 150 millikelvin maximum. That is average signal. It can be above or below that value if you consider the spatial fluctuations as well. So what may happen is the following. Just a second, I think there is. Yeah. What may happen is that instead of looking at a specific patch of sky, because you want to observe the signal from a specific patch of sky for just 5 seconds, 8 seconds, etc. If you look at it for several hours, let's say 1000 hours, then in principle, you will be able to beat down the noise or the uncertainty that creeps into your observed signal due to the noise. You can beat it down significantly. And however, the basic assumption is that the noise is Gaussian random, which may not be the case. In a realistic scenario, the noise may show different kind of behavior. But on the other hand, if you study your instrument well enough, you characterize the noise, its response, or the sensitivity of the instrument for known sources of radiation for a significant amount of time. And if those characterizations are good enough, then in principle, you can get rid of the noise in this manner. Okay. So that is something that people have been doing. Otherwise, people would not have been able to even do radio astronomy, because radio astronomy is mostly about beating down the noise, nothing else. Okay. So, sorry. But the other problems, the second difficult problem that comes into play is something called foregrounds. And I think Tuhinda or Dhiraj might have already discussed about the foregrounds in the context of CMBR observation. So CMBR has an advantage, or let us say, CMBR is a 2D signal, right? Coming from a specific redshift, and I am observing it at a range of redshifts, right? Now I need to know the emission at the same redshift or frequency sorry, not redshift, at the same frequency from other sources that are not CMBR when I'm studying CMBR, right? So I need to know what kind of radiation is coming from my own galaxy, some extragalactic point source. So extragalactic point source are nothing but the radio galaxies that are outside of our galaxy. So what amount of radiation they are basically putting in within a specific frequency range, I need to know that beforehand, so that if I know all those radiations that are coming from other sources other than my target, I can model them, I can remove them from my observed, let's say, recorded observables, and whatever is left, I will assume that that is my signal. However, though it is very easy to say, it is very difficult to do in principle. Why? The problem there is something interesting. So it has to do with something called the resolution of your telescope. So it is not only the sensitivity, the resolution of the telescope is also important here. So there may be let's say I want to see the 21 centimeter in signal in the sky in a specific resolution. I don't need very high resolution. Let us say I will image it or observe it in Fourier space in a very moderate resolution. That's fine. However, even if I am observing the signal in that kind of moderate resolution, within those pixels of my moderate resolution, there might be many extragalactic point sources or some galactic sources as well, which are emitting a huge amount of radiation, which are not of cosmological origin, which are not coming from the hydrogen. So let's say there is a radio galaxy which is emitting a huge amount of radiation at frequency 200 megahertz, and I am targeting to observe the cosmological 21 centimeter signal at 200 megahertz. How would I distinguish between them? It sounds kind of impossible. And this radio galaxy is way brighter compared to my 21 centimeter signal. So it's not even Gaussian random noise. I cannot even remove it the way I remove or get rid of Gaussian random noise. So, and on the other hand, the galaxy, this particular extragalactic point source or the radio galaxy might be so tiny that it I may not be able to distinguish it from a neighboring galaxy within the resolution limit in which I am observing the sky. So I need very high resolution radio observation of all radio sources other than my cosmological 21 centimeter signal to build something called my foreground model. Once I have done that, then only I can remove that model from my observed signal. And that also has to be done very, that model will depend on your instrument, because each instrument has different, let's say, response. And it is very difficult to remove the response function from the actual observed data. Let's say you can think of it, every instrument looks at the same object slightly differently or sees the same object differently. And getting rid of that is a difficult part. So you need to build the sky model or this foreground model for your specific instrument with which you plan to see the cosmological signal. So those things needed to be done very, very precisely. And most of the telescopes all around the world which are targeting to observe this 21 centimeter signal are trying to do precisely that, because that is one of the major obstacles right now. Then the third problem is our upper atmosphere, the ionosphere. So what ionosphere might do to my 21 centimeter signal? What it will do, let's say the 21 centimeter signal is coming from some part of the sky. Now, once it enters the ionosphere, it might get refracted. So I will always look at straight line. I will basically draw back a straight line from the ray that I have observed, right? So it will appear, the source of 21 centimeter signal will appear somewhere else because of this particular refraction. And that may give rise to a wrong interpretation of the signal itself. So understanding the ionosphere, and if ionosphere is very turbulent, this refraction happens over time, over a small period of time, quite a few times, then in most of the cases, people have to actually throw away the data. They can't do much. Because modeling the ionosphere is one of the even more difficult tasks compared to modeling the foregrounds. So that's another challenge. Many people are actually trying to model the ionosphere and or trying to incorporate the errors that ionosphere is introducing to your observation. So up to what level of error you can tolerate? Let's say they want to find out that limit so that they don't have to throw away all the data. Okay. So ionospheric problem is in general a problem for any kind of radio interferometric observation actually. Okay, so those are the major challenges in observing the 21 centimeter signal. Now, if you think about the global signal experiments, that is the monopole experiments like AJAS or SARAS in India, those experiments also have these challenges. They cannot basically bypass these challenges. They also have these challenges. Now, what they are doing and why just alone an AJAS detection is not enough or not convincing enough to the community, one has to understand that also. So what they are doing, see, they do not look at the spatial fluctuation of the signal. They are observing the entire sky and at a fixed frequency and adding up all the signal that is coming from the entire sky. They cannot distinguish on signal from the north, or means from the east to the west, or etc., etc. So there, the foreground modeling is even more difficult. So because what they are observing is a sum which contains noise, which contains your foregrounds, which contains disturbances or errors due to ionosphere, everything. Now, you need to know very precisely if the signal was not there, if the noise was not there, if the ionospheric distortions were not there, how the foreground would have looked like in your monopole experiment. You need to know that very precisely with a very high degree of confidence, so that you can remove that foreground, because you have to effectively subtract it, literally subtract it from your observed data, and then only you will be able to say anything about the signal, system noise, etc., etc. So their foreground modeling is even more important and even more difficult actually. So that's why one need alternative observational approaches to actually confirm whether what Aegis has detected or what SARAS will detect eventually in future are real detection or not. You need basically independent approaches, independent ways to confirm that. And that is why radio interferometric observations are more important, effectively. So far, there are several upper limits of this signal that has been reported. One such upper limit is given in this particular experiment, by this experiment called low frequency array. So they have observed the north celestial pole for 13 hours, and they have measured something called power spectrum. I will get into there, what is power spectrum, etc. And what they have reported was these values of the power spectrum as a function of K mode. What is K mode? What is power spectrum, etc. I will define if it will. So similarly, other experiments, for example, GMRT, Paper, HERA, MWA, all have their own upper limits. So far, none of these experiments have reported. Yeah, sorry. None of these experiments have reported any detection so far. So now, as you can understand, that we are not looking at the global signal anymore, and through radio interferometric observations, we are interested not only in the redshift evolution of the signal, but also spatial fluctuations of the signal, right? Because sometimes it is important to know the spatial fluctuation of the signal as well, because then we will be able to put better constraint or on the reionization sources or models of reionization sources or IGM physics, etc., intergalactic medium physics, etc. So that's why the next question that comes, that is how to quantify and interpret this particular signal using radio interferometric observations. So the quantity that you observe in any radio interferometric observation, the basic quantity that you observe, is called visibility. And I was trying to avoid this particular term so far, but there is no way I can avoid it anymore. So what is visibility? Visibility is nothing but Fourier transform of the sky brightness temperature. And when I say sky brightness temperature, what I mean, sorry, back, yeah, sorry, yeah. Where is the annotation? Yeah, here it is. So what I mean is basically the brightness temperature, a specific intensity coming from all components that we have discussed so far. So let's say the sky temperature, T, let's say sky, if I write, I am not writing TS because that will be confusing. That will be sum of T21. So that is your actual cosmological signal, T noise plus T foreground, everything. So what I observe is a Fourier transform. So Fourier transform of this quantity. Okay. very horrible, but what I mean to say, the equal to sign will be somewhere here, not here. So Fourier transform of this quantity is being recorded at my radio interferometer. Okay, that's a very important thing to basically note, because then actually it makes sense to deal with all kinds of statistics that you can do in Fourier domain. Why it is so? Simply because of the fact, as I said, that the quantity that is being recorded at your radio interferometer is visibility, which is nothing but Fourier transform of sky brightness temperature. What is sky brightness temperature? It is your signal, the target cosmological signal, your foregrounds, your noise, sum of all of these things, right? Now, the fun fact here is that the noise in Fourier domain or in the visibility domain is uncorrelated from visibility to visibility. So there it can be treated as a Gaussian random field. However, the moment you do a Fourier transform, the moment you go from visibility domain to an image domain, because if you Fourier transform the visibilities, you will get into the specific intensity or brightness temperature, right? So once you get in there, what will happen? Each pixel in your image domain will have contribution from all Fourier modes that you have at your disposal. So noise from all Fourier modes will contribute to each of the image pixel. So now noise in image plane will become correlated. So it will become even more difficult to actually deal with the noise in image plane. It is easier to deal with the noise in visibility plane because there you can use this assumption that the noise is uncorrelated from one Fourier mode to the other. So, or you can assume effectively that the noise is Gaussian random in nature to some extent. But in image domain, you cannot assume that. So that's why it is worthwhile to try to define all your signal statistics in Fourier domain. And it is also worthwhile to try to measure all those Fourier statistics without going into the image domain, without making a Fourier transform. You have the visibility data and use the visibility data directly to estimate all signal statistics that you want to do without doing any Fourier transform. Because the moment you do the Fourier transform, you mess up the noise. So that is one of the motivations why people started basically formulating various kinds of signal statistical estimators for the signal in Fourier domain. So one of the prime, let's say, main statistic that is being targeted as the main observable statistic for the signal from these kind of radio interferometric observation is power spectrum. So what is power spectrum? Power spectrum is nothing but, let's say you have these two K modes, K1 and K2. K are Fourier modes. So K is equal to 2 pi by L. L is the length scale, okay, in image domain. So if I am looking at a small k, that means L is large. So if I am looking at a visibility or Fourier transform at a very small k, that means I am looking at the signal at large length scale or signal fluctuations at large length scale. So small k means large length scale, large k means small length scale. You have to keep this thing in mind while looking at any power spectrum or any Fourier statistics, so as to say. So what is power spectrum? It is nothing but two visibility correlation or correlation between two Fourier transform of the signal. If I assume for the time being that there is no foreground, no noise, nothing, only cosmological signal, then it is nothing but the correlation between Fourier transform of the brightness temperature at two different k modes. Now, and an ensemble average of it from a large collection of, let's say, Fourier transform of brightness temperature that you have. And with a condition that these two k modes are related with each other via this delta function, which is k1 plus k2 equal to 0. That means that Fourier, this particular signal estimator assumes that the signal is homogeneous and isotropic. So it does not assign the any direction dependence to the signal. It assumes that the signal is homogeneous and isotropic. So only the amplitude of k matters, not the direction of the k. So k1 will be equal to minus k2 if I write it in terms of vector equation. And V is nothing but the volume over which this estimation is being done. So if it can be your simulation volume, it can be your observation volume, whatever. So Pk is that's why it is represented with only one k mode, or the amplitude of the k mode. It is not represented with the vector, sorry, the direction of the k mode. So Pk is your power spectrum, and it measures nothing but the amplitude of fluctuation at that specific k mode or that specific length scale, which is represented by that k mode. So power spectrum is nothing but amplitude square of fluctuation in the signal at different length scale. What is the amplitude square of fluctuation? It is nothing but the variance. If you think about in terms of if you have a field and if you are trying to calculate the variance, you are calculating it, let's say at the pixel level. So that is the resolution element at which you have the data. Now you can smooth your data with different filter, different sizes of filter, and you can measure the sigma square as a function of those filter sizes, right? You can increase the filter size or decrease the filter size as you wish, and you will have the fluctuation, amplitude of fluctuation square, amplitude square of the fluctuations at that specific length scale. The same is represented by power spectrum, but in Fourier domain, nothing else. Okay. The other important factor that one should keep in mind that in radio interferometry, actually k equal to 0 mode is not recorded. It is not recorded simply because of the fact you cannot put one radio interferometric element means, let's say, antenna or a dish on top of the other, because k's are measured in terms of the distance between two elements in a plane perpendicular to the line of sight of observation. Okay. That is something called baseline, and baseline is related to these k modes. Okay. So as the baseline cannot be 0, so separation between two elements cannot be 0, so you cannot measure the mean of the signal. So you can only measure the fluctuations in the signal. Okay. So that is what is power spectrum is all about. However, as you can see that power spectrum will be able to define a signal which is Gaussian random in nature, simply because of the fact it is measuring nothing but the sigma or the variance of the signal at different length scale. So if it is a Gaussian random signal, power spectrum is enough to define it completely. You don't need any higher order statistics. That's it. You can stop there and you can estimate your model parameter using this statistic alone. You don't need anything else. However, we will eventually see that this 21 centimeter signal coming from either dark ages or cosmic dawn or epoch of reionization or even post epoch of reionization are highly non-Gaussian. And non-Gaussianity of the signal, it is not the primordial non-Gaussianity I'm talking about. It is the non-Gaussianity that is driven by the physics at different stages of our IGM physics, that is observed at different stages of the evolution of our universe. It is mostly astrophysical non-Gaussianity in most of the cases, except the post-reionization case. There it is cosmological non-Gaussianity, but it is not the primordial non-Gaussianity that we are looking for. So during the cosmic dawn and during the epoch of reionization, it is mostly driven by the astrophysical processes. The non-Gaussianity is driven by the astrophysical processes. And we will eventually discuss them, most likely tomorrow. So what I was trying to basically emphasize on the fact is that you can actually measure the variance of the signal if you wish. And if you plot it as a function of redshift, you will see a plot something like this. Obviously, this variance is measured at the resolution element of a certain experiment, let us say. So you will see, and it is only measured within the reionization period. It is not necessarily covering the cosmic dawn or the earlier phases of the universe. So the first thing that one should note from the definition of the power spectrum, because it is nothing but the Fourier transform of the variance, it is always positive by definition. If it is an auto power spectrum of the signal, it will be always positive because it's amplitude square of the fluctuations, just like the variance. Okay. So even if the brightness temperature is negative, your variance of the brightness temperature fluctuation will be positive. However, here this particular shape is seen only for a specific reionization model, and cosmic dawn era is not encoded within this region. Again, the power spectrum is plotted in this right-hand panel as a function of K modes and in units of millikelvin square. So what is being plotted here is not necessarily the pk. K cube pk divided by 2 pi square, that particular quantity is being plotted. And this is done, this is though it is called dimensionless power spectrum, but it has a dimension, it has the dimension of temperature square, millikelvin square. Why it is called dimensionless power spectrum? Because if you recall from your large scale structure lectures from Tirthoda or Anjana, I think maybe Dhiraj has also mentioned that when you are looking at the density fluctuation, matter density fluctuation, so how do you measure the matter density power spectrum? You basically take the fluctuations in matter density, and if you have the pk of the matter density or the dark matter density, if you multiply with it, because it's fluctuations only, so it's a dimensionless quantity. If you just multiply, pk will have a volume unit in terms of its unit, and if you multiply with it k cube, that will cancel out because k is 2 pi by L, so inverse of volume it will be. So it will cancel out this dimension of pk, and what you will get is a dimensionless power spectrum. So this word dimensionless power spectrum actually carries forward from the dark matter power spectrum. Though the 21 centimeter power spectrum, even if you write it in terms of k cube pk divided by 2 pi square, it is not dimensionless, it is millikelvin square. Please keep this in mind. But in various papers, you will read that people call it dimensionless power spectrum, but it is not dimensionless originally. Okay, so the important thing to note here is that there is this redshift. These different colors represent different redshift, and at each redshift, you have different neutral fractions. So this is basically average neutral fraction. So the fraction of the IGM that is still neutral, that is represented by this this particular quantity xh1 bar, average neutral fraction. So see this black line, black solid line, it is almost fully neutral. So if you look at the power spectrum, this black solid line, so these bars are essentially error bars or sample variance error bars on the power spectrum. This power spectrum will look almost like a matter power spectrum if you plot it as k cube pk divided by 2 pi square. Within this k range, you will see the matter power spectrum almost follows this black solid line, simply because of the fact that we are assuming neutral hydrogen is following the dark matter distribution, and neutral hydrogen is almost fully neutral at this particular stage. And the other important fact is that we are looking at power spectrum in the reionization era here. So we have assumed that heating has been saturated, spin temperature is also very high. So spin temperature is much larger than CMB at temperature. So 1 minus T gamma by Ts, that factor is 1. So all fluctuations that I am seeing in terms of the signal fluctuations that I am seeing are due to the hydrogen distribution fluctuation, neutral hydrogen distribution fluctuation. So this will more or less follow the dark matter distribution with dark matter power spectrum with a bias factor with it. However, as reionization progresses, what happens is something like this. Let me, play it around. Where it is? Just a second. Sorry. No, it's not here. I'm sorry. Yes, I think it's there. Yeah. So I want to show you this animation. So this animation only covers the reionization part. Why it is not working? Just a second. Yes. No, for some reason, it is downloaded, so I can play it from. Right. So this particular animation only covers the reionization part. It does not cover the cosmic dawn or the dark ages part. So what I want you to concentrate on the right hand side, essentially it shows the eventual structures that are being formed, which will host these first sources of lights, etc. So the dots that you will see appearing on the right hand side are the host of these first sources of light, or the halos, dark matter halos, essentially. And on the left hand side, it shows the brightness temperature of the 21 centimeter signal at different neutral fractions. Okay, so you will see, yeah, these dots on the right hand side are our halos. On the left hand side, as you can see, the IGM, the XH1 is gradually reducing. So you will start seeing holes in this box. So though the color scheme is a bit difficult to understand. So here, as you can see, there is a black hole. So that means you can see through the box in these regions. Actually, there are portions where you can see through this box. So those regions are ionized regions. So as more and more sources appear, they start to ionize more and more hydrogen around them, and they start to empty the hydrogen, and that is what actually determines the fluctuations. Yeah, so at this stage, as you can see, this is a channel of ionized hydrogen, my cursor, if you follow, and the locations where you can see black, basically you can see the background, so you can basically pierce through the box and go to the other side in those regions. But there are other channels where, let's say, there is a neutral hydrogen wall behind, but on the surface there are certain channels had already produced, like these ones, which are completely ionized. So they now are deciding the fluctuations in the 21 centimeter signal. So here, look at average neutral fraction is 0.3. And by the time I think we will end, yeah, it is, for example, if I pause the thing, right. So, for example, here is a big hole and there are ionized channels that are being formed. So what I am trying to say is that if it was let us assume it's a Gaussian random field, right? And neutral fraction, so these ionized regions are appearing randomly. Here, ionized regions are actually not appearing randomly. They are appearing only around the sources first, sources where ionizing photons are being produced first, and then they are gradually growing and merging with each other. But let us assume that reionization didn't happen in this manner. So randomly pixels are getting ionized in this image plane or image domain, let us say. So in that case, I can treat the 21 centimeter signal fluctuation as a Gaussian random field, right? So my power spectrum should be, or the variance should be enough to describe the signal fluctuation. So in that case, where I will expect, at what neutral fraction I would expect the maximum amplitude of fluctuations, when half of the pixels are neutral and the other half is ionized, right? When that situation will appear, I should expect the maximum amplitude in power spectrum or maximum amplitude in variance, right? That is what my expectation should be if the signal is a Gaussian random field, correct? But even if it is not a Gaussian random field, maybe the peak in the power spectrum or peak in the variance will appear somewhere in the middle or midpoint of reionization when the neutral fraction is 50%. So that is what is happening if I go back into my plot here. So look at the neutral fraction 0.5 scenario, that is this brown colored line. So it is redshift 8. So first of all, let us look at the variance at the level of resolution of my simulation or resolution of the experiment. Variance is peaked around slightly less than redshift 9. So I think redshift 8 would be somewhere here. So variance is peaking somewhere close to redshift 8. It is changing slightly simply because of the fact that my signal is not Gaussian random field. That's why the peak is appearing slightly before than redshift 8. Here also, I will see that I can see that my neutral fraction 0.5 case actually gives me the highest amplitude power spectrum for k equal to slightly larger than 0.1. And then from 0.1 onwards, up to this point, it stays higher than all other power spectrum. And then it kind of declines. So what does it tell you? It tells you, so 0.1 MPC inverse means you can calculate it yourself. So k is equal to 2 pi by L. So 2 into 3.14 divided by, let's say roughly 0.1. So 3 into 2, 6 divided by 0.1. So it is kind of 60 megaparsec in terms of length scale, of the order of 60 megaparsec, let us say. So 60 megaparsec is significantly large length scale. So how large is considered as large length scale in cosmology? The length scale where cosmological principles are valid. Where cosmological principles are valid means, how can I say that cosmological principles are valid at a certain length scale? That means the statistical nature of the fluctuations of a particular cosmological field that you are looking at, that becomes homogeneous and isotropy. So it is statistical homogeneity and isotropy that is important, not necessarily means we are not looking at homogeneity and isotropy as literally. We are looking at statistical homogeneity and isotropy. So if I calculate a statistical quantity at that length scale and take an ensemble average, I basically move my estimator in different direction in the sky, it should give me the same value with the same kind of tolerance level or same kind of error bar. So I can say that 60 megaparsec is kind of in the ballpark of the large length scale in cosmology. So where cosmological principles will be valid. So what I can say from this particular plot is that power spectrum at large length scale becomes maximum when reionization is roughly halfway through, or close to maximum when reionization is roughly halfway through. Okay. Power spectrum at length scale even larger than 60 megaparsec actually is higher in case of neutral fraction 0.15. That also tells me that where basically 85% of the universe is already ionized. So that also tells me that the signal itself is not fully Gaussian. There is a significant amount of non-Gaussianity that is present in the signal, and we can further understand this non-Gaussianity because of the fact how this signal is being produced. So how this signal is being produced, or the fluctuations in the signal is being produced. First of all, I am identifying spatial biased region in the space where matter has collapsed to form the first bound objects. These first bound objects will hold or host my first sources of lights. These first sources of lights will essentially ionize their surrounding intergalactic medium. First, they will obviously ionize the circumgalactic medium, and then they will go on ionizing the intergalactic medium. And then these ionized regions will gradually grow in size. So ionized regions are, first of all, not produced randomly in space. They are produced at preferred, or let's say chosen location or biased location. So that itself introduces a significant degree of non-Gaussianity. And further, these ionized regions do not stay at the same size all over the cosmic time. They gradually grow in size. So the nature of that non-Gaussianity is also evolving with time. So it's a way more complex signal compared to, let's say, if you think about CMBR, right? CMBR is not changing with time. But this particular signal is so complex. We have already discussed how it changes in cosmic dawn, how the spin temperature plays such a dominant role in cosmic dawn. But even in reionization, when we thought that the problems related to the variation in spin temperature are now over, and I am just concerned with the neutral fraction, even then the neutral fraction evolves in a very complex manner from point to point in the space. And that's why the signal itself is very, very complicated. So far, what people have tried to do, as like any other cosmological signal, you have a signal statistic. Once you observe the signal, you quantify that particular statistic from your observation, and then you compare the predicted statistics from your model with this observed statistics and find out the best possible model parameter that can explain your observed signal. That is what people try to do, right? Even for CMBR, even for large scale structure, for galaxy redshift surveys, etc. People exactly try to do that. And this comparison between the model and observation is done via various kinds of statistical framework. Let's say the most popular one is mostly either you do this Fisher matrix analysis, or you can do the Bayesian inference, etc. So people have been trying to do this Bayesian inference using 21 centimeter signal power spectrum. Because, okay, the other point that I have missed earlier, and it's an important point to highlight, is that why all these instruments around the world are trying to detect the signal using power spectrum. Because that is the first statistics that these instruments can measure, because they cannot measure the mean, I had mentioned already. So they can only measure something that is equivalent to variance. And they can measure this, let's say, Fourier transform of the variance at different length scales. That is exactly what they are doing. So that is the first 0th level of statistics for them. Power spectrum is the first statistic that one can measure. So one need to measure these statistics in such a manner that the signal to noise ratio for power spectrum measurement is high enough. So one have to beat down the noise. So one have to observe the same patch of sky for long enough period to be able to even detect this power spectrum. And obviously, even before measuring the power spectrum, one has to remove the foreground, one has to remove or throw away the data which is probably corrupted by your turbulence in ionosphere, etc., etc. So let us say all those things are done. Foregrounds are perfectly removed, etc. And you have only the signal, and then you have calculated the power spectrum from your visibilities. And then you compare with your model. So here comes the model that Tirthoda has discussed earlier. What Tirthoda has shown you essentially how to simulate, let's say, the reionization. That one of the animation that I showed to you is an outcome of one such simulation. So how to simulate this neutral hydrogen density field at different cosmic times, during the cosmic dawn, during the epoch of reionization, even in the post-reionization. That is what he had tried to demonstrate. Now, once you have these simulations, so one simulation represents one model for a specific set of parameters, specific value of parameter. Now, just imagine if you are doing a Bayesian analysis, what you are essentially doing, you are basically letting multiple random walker to walk in a multi-dimensional parameter space, and you are asking them to take millions or billions of steps. And for each step of the random walker in this multi-dimensional parameter space, you have a set of parameter values. So what you have to do there, you have to then get the expected signal statistic for that set of parameter value. How will you get the expected signal statistics for that set of parameter value? You will simulate it for a given simulation setup. You will put these parameters in your simulation and you will ask, okay, tell me what is the power spectrum, or tell me what is the variance, etc., at this particular redshift for this set of parameters. And you will get that outcome, put it in your Bayesian, in your likelihood, you will compare it with the observed power spectrum and take the next step. Now imagine if you have to, that means for each random step, you have to run your simulation every time. So now if there are billions of steps or millions of steps taken by one random walker, and there are multiple, sometimes hundreds or thousands of random walkers walking in the parameter space, then you have to run your simulation huge number of times. And that actually becomes a major bottleneck in statistical inference or parameter estimation from power spectrum. So many people have come up with various kinds of, let's say, optimization schemes with which you can either bypass the simulation or you can speed up the simulation. So one such scheme is this 21CMMC, where essentially you speed up the simulation by doing certain approximations in your simulation. And using their MCMC basically pipeline, they have predicted how well they can constrain the parameters within a reasonable computing time and with reasonable amount of computing resources. So that is the final outcome you would like to see from any observation of 21 centimeter signal. So you would like to see how these parameters are being constrained. So there are many of these parameters are already discussed by Tirthuda. For example, the zeta or anion was one parameter that Tirthuda has discussed. That is the efficiency of producing ionizing photon. The other one is the mean free path of the ionizing photon. And then this T minimum virial is essentially also represented as something called minimum halo mass to host a galaxy. So that is another parameter for reionization. And there are other parameters. For example, this is the X-ray photon production efficiency and X-ray photon spectrum, etc., Raman alpha coupling factor, etc. So those things are again associated with the late stage of, let us say, cosmic dawn or the early stage of epoch of reionization. So here they have used this 5-parameter model to constrain the reionization, 5-parameter model to constrain the parameters for a given power spectrum observation. Okay, so this is one such demonstration, but I think I will go into further detail of these things maybe, yeah, tomorrow in the first half. So I plan to discuss, okay, I have already surpassed the time scale. Sorry. So I wish to discuss some higher order statistics of the signal and why they are needed and their usefulness, and this C2 intensity mapping signal, how to basically model it or simulate it, and then some hands-on session tomorrow. Sorry, Pratik, I have taken half an hour extra, or I have not.
It's absolutely all right. We're doing science.
Okay, fine.
Okay. So,
yeah,
time
if
for
there are questions.
Sorry?
Yeah, if there are any questions from the participants.
Okay, so maybe they are keeping the questions reserved for the hands-on session.
Acha. So if you want, you can also, if you have some questions, you can write it on the Slack channel as well. I will try to answer them there or in the next day. If something comes up in your mind, please write it here. Okay.
Okay, so if there is no question as of now, then let's thank Suman for a wonderful session once again.
Thank you.
And all for being here. We'll meet once again tomorrow at 11:20 with the same speakers.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.